All right, today we're going to talk about the backup contract addendum. This was a popular topic recently. It was before the pandemic happened, and I imagine it will come around in phases. So we're going to talk about this addendum that not a lot of people have used, but I think it's a valuable tool for your sellers and for your buyers when they're looking and the inventory is extremely low like we're in right now. So we're going to start at the top here. This is Form 2A1-T from the North Carolina Association of Realtors and the North Carolina Bar Association. This is the 2022 form. So up top, we're looking at the property, address, seller, and buyer. Now notice this is an addendum. So an addendum is an addition to the contract. So you do have to fill out the regular 2T offer to purchase and add this addendum to it. You notice the next line says that this addendum is attached to and made part of the offer to purchase. This is a backup contract. If you're a seller, you want a backup contract because it puts pressure on your primary buyer. That's a term you're going to hear me talk about a lot in this video is primary buyer. That's the buyer that's currently under contract on the property that you and your client want. But as a seller, you want a backup contract because it puts pressure on the buyer, the primary buyer, to maybe not ask for as many repairs, maybe to expedite the home inspection or getting things closed. So I think the backup contract addendum can be a very powerful tool for us. Next paragraph says a buyer and seller acknowledge that the seller has previously entered into an offer to purchase with blank, insert last name only. That is the primary buyer, the person that's currently under contract, and that this backup contract is accepted in a secondary or a backup position. Number one, the condition, it is a condition of the backup contract that the primary contract is terminated as described below before buyer and seller shall be obligated to perform under this backup contract. Number two, termination of the primary contract. Termination shall be evidenced by a written release by all parties. We've all seen the termination document. Written notice of termination from seller to primary buyer that the seller is exercising the right to terminate the primary contract, or written notice of termination from the primary buyer to the seller, or hopefully not, but a final judgment of a court of competent jurisdiction that the primary contract's invalid, illegal, unenforceable, or is otherwise terminated. Number three, indemnification, hold harmless. Seller shall indemnify the buyer and hold the buyer harmless for any and all claims, damages or costs or attorney's fees incurred by the buyer as a result of the buyer's reliance upon any wrongful or ineffective termination of the primary contract. Number four, modification of a primary contract. So if the primary contract gets modified, your due diligence amount changes, your earnest money changes, your due diligence date changes, your closing date changes, that is not a termination. Number five, access to primary contract. Buyer and seller agree that the buyer may not examine or otherwise have access to the primary contract without written permission from the buyer, and the seller and the primary buyer. Seller represents that the primary contract calls for the settlement date of blank. That way, your backup buyer is not sitting around waiting on things to happen. They know when to expect closing. Number six, closing on primary contract. In the event the primary contract closes, then this backup contract shall be null and void. There's no home to buy, right? Someone else bought it. and the earnest money shall be refunded. Number 7, notification of termination of primary contract. This is how your buyer is going to get notified that, hey, your buyer is now in the primary position. Your buyer needs to get their stuff together because the clock starts ticking, because you are now in primary position. Number 8 on page 2, the top of page 2, talks about earnest money, due diligence money, and settlement dates. This is the biggest question I have when it comes to backup addendums. Do we pay earnest money? Do we pay due diligence immediately? This form answers all that. The number 8, letter A says initial earnest money deposits shall be made payable and delivered to the escrow agent, even though it's in backup position, and shall be deposited promptly upon receipt into the escrow agent's trust account. So once you get the backup addendum signed, the contract signed, you have to, just like you would with a primary contract, you have to deliver the earnest money, even though you're in backup position. B, additional earnest money. Any additional earnest money shall be due and payable, delivered to the escrow agent no later than 5 p.m. on the date that is blank days following the delivery to the buyer notice of primary status. Anytime you see a blank, those are negotiable items. Letter C says due diligence fee. This is usually the biggest one, especially during COVID. This was a real big question. Any due diligence fee provided for in this contract shall be due and payable to the seller upon delivery to the buyer, notice of primary status, and delivered within 2 days thereafter. So when you put in a backup offer and it gets accepted, and now you're in the backup position, number 8, letter C is telling you, you do not have to pay the due diligence money right then, but you do once you're given a notice you're in primary status. Letter D, due diligence period of this contract shall extend to 5 p.m. on the last day of blank. Letter E, settlement date. Settlement date of this contract shall be the date that is blank days following the seller's delivery to the buyer of notice of primary status. So this buyer, this notice of primary status really gets the clock ticking for your buyers. That's when the due diligence period starts, clock starts ticking. That's when the closing date starts ticking. I'll read the blue block. It says, note, instead of inserting dates in the additional earnest money deposit, due diligence period and settlement date blanks in the contract, insert C, attached backup contract addendum. Make sure you make note of that. Number 9, the buyer's right to terminate. The buyer may terminate this backup contract without liability by giving written notice of termination to the seller at any time prior to receipt of being placed in the backup or primary status, and earnest money shall be refunded. So give your termination before you're given notice that you're in primary status. Automatic termination. In the event, the buyer must receive notice of primary status from the seller no later than 5 p.m. on blank. It's negotiable, time being of the essence. And then a couple of the notes in bold type, we will read, in event of a conflict between the addendum and the backup contract, this addendum shall control, except that in the case of such conflict as to the description of the property or identity of the buyer or seller. And then your signatures are below. We're not done yet, right? You notice it says page 2 of 3. This last page, notice to buyer that the backup contract is now in effect. That means your buyer was backup and now they're in primary status. So it says notice is hereby given to blank from seller under the backup contract between them dated blank, that the primary contract with blank, that was the former buyer, is terminated, as evidenced by the attached. and then you're going to check which one that former primary buyer, how they gave you the termination. And now your buyer's in primary status. So hopefully that helped. This is one that you don't see a lot, but you need to know how to fill it out because it can be a valuable tool for both your seller